on the share. How do I do that? Yes.
And then share again.
Stop share there.
And then just go again.
Sorry for this, folks. I just need to ensure that the sound is on the presentation. And back we go. And I seem to have lost the presentation. No. I'm screen sharing. There it is. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank a whole bunch of people, in particular, the 3 or 4 people in the Jewish Genealogy Society who said to me, why don't you do something about your mum? Because without that, I probably wouldn't have started. And I also have to say, you don't know how much work you've given me, and it's far from over. However, it has been a fascinating journey of rediscovery and new discovery, and it has certainly made things interesting. The only thing is, I can't see how I get rid of this bar. Oh, got it. Thank you. Right. So, welcome to the first part of Thoroughly Modernizing Millie. What I've tried to do, and people who've heard me speak before know that I like to use people who are related in some way to tell the story that I'm telling. And in particular, I like to do it using family members. Why is this not? So I like to use family members, and I'm going to start with an apology. And the apology is, sorry for the canto memoritis. And for those of you who don't know what canto memoritis is, it is an inherited condition which I inherited from my mother. Translated literally, it means irritation of the song memory. And like her, everything I ever see, hear, or read reminds me of a song. And so some of the stories that I will be telling will be through family members, through songs. So let's start with the first one. Well, I would, except it doesn't seem to want to move on. Whoops. Wonderful, the presentation has stuck. Ah, there it goes. And the first person is this gentleman, Sami Khan, who was related, a cousin by marriage, and his song will introduce the whole of this talk. And singing it will be 2 people who are also related but distantly. And I'm not going to give you all of the relatives, all of the relationships, because some of them are complicated. But where I do, they will either fade in or they will spin in, and you will see how these people are related. So here goes. Well, it would, except the sound isn't working. I did. And this is really important because, let me try and escape from it and try stop. I'm sorry about this. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to reshare. It says shared sound. Oh, wait a minute. I turned my sound off. I muted my sound because of problems that we were having in the room. So back we go. And Share screen.
We provide the sound.
And back to meeting.
Guess the song.
Doesn't seem to.
Not sound of music.
Sorry?
You're still sharing. You need to stop it and go back to.
I've stopped. I've already stopped and gone back.
No, but I think you clicked on the wrong thing when you went back. There we go.
Share screen,
Yep. And then you want
share sound.
the middle one, don't you?
Thank you.
That's right.
Oh, sorry,
Okay, so,
Oh.
and back we go to there and play. Doesn't want to, isn't it wonderful? There we go. Okay.
Everything today is thoroughly modern. Bands are getting jazzier. Everything today is starting to go. Cars are getting snazzier. Men say it's criminal what women will do. What they're forgetting is this is 1922.
And 1922 is where our story starts. 100 years ago this weekend, in 9 Windsor Terrace in Shoreditch, my mother was born. Not, as you might think, in the workhouse, but as you see, the birth certificate, number 9 Windsor Terrace, 8th of April, Millie, girl, born to Barney and Sarah. And we go back to 1921 to the census, and we can see that the family had come from various parts of Europe, but I'm going to head 7 miles east to East Ham, to the home of the Yankeloviches, my father's family. And you will see there that the parents and the mother of my grandfather had come from Russia, claiming to be Russia Odessa, Russia Bessarabia, and Russia Kiev. And I'm going to pick up on those and transport you 1,400 miles east to Ukraine in 1921. And on this map, you can see my great-grandmother at the top, who was from Kiev, my grandmother, who was from Kishinev, now known as Chisinau in Bessarabia, and my grandfather, who was from Odessa in what was then Ukraine, but he considered it Russia. And just a year later, 1922, Russia invaded and wiped out Bessarabia. So if you look at the map now, there is no Bessarabia. We've got Moldova where some of Bessarabia used to be, but it's not there. And there was a big difference in the changes on the invasion that took place then and the invasion that took place now. My grandparents and great-grandmother had fled. The family before that had fled in pogroms on various occasions. And very often, when they left the country, people were murdered as they arrived in neighboring countries, such as Poland or Romania or Lithuania. And it's very different from what's happening today in Ukraine. So Russia had taken over all of that space, just as it's attempting to do now. And I'm going to ask you to have 1 minute silence in support of the people in Ukraine. And to help you with that, because I never know how long a minute is, here's a minute. And we're back in Islington, or in Windsor Terrace in 1922. And you see where it says workhouse, she wasn't actually born in the workhouse. The workhouse was the black building on the right. She was born more or less where that star is, and it had a backyard that backed onto the workhouse. And when I say a backyard, it was literally 1 yard, and then there was a wall. And she was born in a house which has fairly auspicious connections, as we will see. If we look at the people who were living there, my grandparents in 1921 had come from Amsterdam and Antwerp and London. My mum always said they were born in a triangle, and I never understood what she meant by born in a triangle. But I realized this is it. She said they could have been born in any one of those 3 places because the family traveled between them. And in addition, when she was young, they used to travel from London to Antwerp by boat for half a crown to visit the grandparents. So there are my grandparents and my mother's older sister and brother, all of the people who were there in 1921 with their place and dates of birth. And back we come to Windsor Terrace. This gentleman lived there too, while his parents were living here. That was the Marshalsea prison, and this was Charles Dickens, who lived there while his parents were in the in the debtors' prison. So I'm going to go back on that. I can't. The household consisted of 4 people. And as you can see, it shows my grandfather was a diamond polisher, but he was out of work. And I couldn't understand how they survived. And then I remembered both sets of grandparents are shown on the 1921 census as being out of work. And I remember my mother telling me, and my father telling me, that they all worked in street markets. And my dad used to boast that he could juggle crockery on a market stall in order to sell it. So here is an example.
When you're bowling down the lane, when you're strolling down the lane, no one cares who you are. You look stupid in a Rolls Royce car. When you're bustling down the lane, when you're hustling down the lane, if you stand and you wait, you'll bump into all your long lost mates. Lovers go passing through, happy girl and happy fella. Does he know what she do for a glass of sarsaparilla? First you lose your watch and chain, then you buy it back again. There is only one place, Sunday down the lane. When you're bowling down the
So next to where they lived stood the Angel Theatre until 1850. And looking up, you could see the Angel, where my bank still is, and looking down, you could see this, St. Mary Le Beau, meaning that my mother, like me and my sister, were all born in the sound of Bow Bells, and we're true Cockneys. And my mother and her sister are the 2 I'm going to focus on today, because they were born after the 1921 census. My mum in 22, her sister Yetta in 23. And they stuck together right through their lives, as you will see as this progresses. But you may or may not remember from that very brief picture of the angel. The angel had been initially a tavern. Can you hear me now? No, it's other people that I'm worried about. I don't know whether or not they've heard any of this. I hope they will be telling Daniel at least. The Angel, as I said, had become a music hall with a capacity of 2,500. Then it grew to 4,000. And one of its biggest stars, who will come across a little later, was Marie Lloyd. But to tell you a bit about the street, and just a little bit, and this is a song that most of you will probably know, and I always thought it was a children's song. What I discovered in doing my research is that it was a dance craze in the 1850s that started here and spread to the United States and became international. So I'm going to use the husband of a cousin to tell you about it. And this is him.
Yeah, half a pound of tuppenny rice, half a pound of treacle. That's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel. Up and down the city road, in and out of the Eagle. That's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel.
Right, so this is the new Eagle that was built in 1901. The original Eagle was bought by the Salvation Army and demolished. But if you want to know how Tony Newley was related, this is the relationship between him and my mum. His wife, a certain Joan Collins, whom you may have heard of, and my mother shared seventh great grandparents. And that was, sorry, my mother and her sister. We've got very few pictures of my mother as a child. Somewhere along the way, and I'll explain it at the end, I lost a lot of photo albums. I lost a scrapbook covering nearly 30 years of her life, and I'll explain that later on. So this is one of the few pictures I do have. This is a genuine picture I took at Southend-on-Sea, and that's my mum. I'm guessing around the age of 2 or 3, and I'm guessing that she was at Southend-on-Sea because she had a lot of relatives there. And this is my mum as a street fighter somewhere around 1925. I don't know if you can guess who she is, but in a moment I will help you. But I was told that when this picture was taken, and these are the children that she grew up with, these are the children with whom she played and fought in the street, she had just beaten up a much bigger, older boy who was bullying one of the girls. And apparently she had had her hair in 2 pigtails, but one of them had come undone. And if you hadn't guessed, this is her, and that's her sister. And this is one of the few other pictures I have of her before she got married, basically. I'm guessing she was aged about 9, and it says on the back, Millie with whiskey. And I presume that's not a drink, but it's the feline that she's clutching. And if we look at the electoral registers, we can see something that she told me about. Now, these have got a bit mixed up in the presentation, so I may just flick through them. But she always told me that the house in which she was born had 6 rooms, 6 families, a sink on the 1st floor landing, and a toilet in the backyard. And I've gone through the electoral registers and I've gone through the census records, and I've only been able to trace 5 families. But I also see that in some of these, in the census return, her family was living in 2 rooms. And it's kind of significant because from probably 12 or 13 until 1929, they lived in that house in either 1 or 2 rooms. And my mum and her sister shared a bed, and they continued to share a bed until my mum got married. So we have here some, I hope, changing electoral registers, although they don't appear to, oh, there they go. You can see my grandfather and my grandmother. In other words, the vote had come. Sorry if they repeat. As I said, I think these got a bit mixed. But all of a sudden, for the first time, women had got the vote. And Barney, my grandfather, was joined by Sarah, his wife, being eligible to vote. And they took advantage. And their lives and my mother's lives were changed forever. And so you get a woman voting in nearby Stepney, the old hands in Stepney, bright young things, and the first group of women MPs on the terrace of the House of Commons in 1931. And round about this time, in fact, 1929, they left Windsor Terrace. This is a picture of Windsor Terrace as it is today. The pictures that rushed through before you missed, and I'll try and get back to them afterwards if anybody wants to see them, because although Charles Dickens only lived in the house for a few weeks, trying to earn the money as a 12-year-old to buy his parents out of debtor's prison, the house figures prominently in the book David Copperfield and is lived in by one Mr. Micawber. And the picture that we missed earlier on was of Mr. Micawber. And the house would have been where the arrow is there, and we will see it later. But let's head towards their new home. No, altogether now because of COVID. And they'd arrived at 16 Brighton Road, the house on the left. And this shows you the route that they'd taken. There's the house a few months ago. And in the neighborhood were all the things that were going to be important. So we've got her school, Princess May, the local cinema, the Ambassador, now a mosque, her dentist, Barney Copkin, who it turns out was related, Dr. Cheney, the local doctor, and this is how Barney Copkin, her dentist, was related. And if anybody's interested in these, I can go through them at a later time afterwards if you're interested. And on a slightly wider area, we had the local library, the swimming pool, Shacklewell Lane Synagogue and Ridley Road Market, all very important parts of her local environment. But very soon, she had to head back towards where she'd come from. Although the family didn't move, she found herself in the position of getting a scholarship to attend Dame Alice Owen's Grammar School. And Dame Alice Owen's Grammar School was considered, I think, fairly posh. And I'm guessing, but I don't know, that she cycled there. This is the copy of her scholarship award. And here's a bit of information about the school, which was founded in 1381 by Dame Alice Owen, who was the widow of a very rich brewer who survived an arrow accident. She was shot accidentally and decided that this was the sign that she should endow education. And so she set up this school, which my mum was a sort of beneficiary of for slightly over 3 years. It's right by the Angel. Here are some pictures of it. Here's a picture of the statue of Dame Alice Owen. That was a more modern sculpture done in the 19th century. And there's the school's coat of arms. And it has the 2 arrows which shot her, nothing to do with a war or a battle. And it's got, I always used to think these were bees, but they turn out to be beer barrels and sheaves of, I think, barley. And I had to put in this picture, and I did it because if you saw the picture of her earlier with her whiskey, you may have noticed something strange. She was bow-legged, and she always said that when they learned that she was bow-legged at school, they gave her extra physiotherapy and exercises. And by the time I knew her, she had very straight legs. So it just goes to show what a bit of care in education can do. And in case you'd forgotten, that was what her legs looked like when she was 8 or 9. In fact, the milkman who used to let him ride her horse if she delivered milk for him said, she looks like she could sit the same with or without the horse. So she always looks old, even as a 2-year-old, she looks old. This is Shacklewell Lane Synagogue, now a mosque. I know she went to a youth club there. I don't know whether it was this one, but this is possibly the scene of one of the crimes, because my parents met at a summer camp of the Jewish Lads and Girls Brigades. And I'm not going to go into all the family connections of the people who founded the organization, but it turns out they were all relatives, and she couldn't possibly have known that. She got her first part-time job in Soho, rather smart, but she was much more aware of what was going on around her than a lot of other people. And her first job was for a refugee organization that was helping to bring Jews from Europe. And she left it after 3 weeks in disgust, because she realized that the only Jews that they were helping were the ones with money. And she could not and would not be part of something that only helped the rich. And that was something that stuck with her throughout her life. So she moved on to, and she was working part-time while she did a course in shorthand and typing. So her next job, and it was her first full-time job, was having given up on this, which she thought was important work, but it wasn't what the organization was doing. It was at the Elephant and Castle. And it sounds a long way away from Stoke Newington, but actually, if she cycled, it was about 30 minutes. And there's the Elephant and Castle, originally traffic the same, and the place that she worked was Montague Burton's. And it turns out that Montague Burton was related. She couldn't have known. He certainly wouldn't have known. He wasn't there anyway. His family was in Leeds, and most of his work was conducted from Leeds, but they had stores all over the country. And what did she do? Well, not quite sure, but she struggled with the technology of the time, which included this. It was a tube system which took cash from a central cash desk to a central cash office, where it was retrieved from containers that had gone through little pneumatic tubes and sent back with receipts and with change. And she struggled with it for some time, but she apparently did okay, but she was looking for a better job. And she soon managed to get some secretarial work. However, there's an interesting point about this building. We were driving past the Elephant and Castle one day, and I pointed out this building, which is where I had my first full-time job. And it's on the site of the building where she had her first full-time job. So there's the Elephant and Castle and the cross marks where my office was, which is one of those strange coincidences. I was working as an architectural assistant for the Department of the Environment, which no longer exists, and she was working for Montague Burton. And back we go to Brighton Road, and her next serious job, I think she had others in between, was at Clerkenwell Green. And it was the job that she held right through the war. And although she started off as a shorthand typist, I gather that she rose to quite a serious management position. This is what it looked like originally. That's its interior hall. This is the back of the building in the 19th century. And this is what that same facade looked like in 1939 when she started working there. And I can't tell you what she did there because she was subject to the Official Secrets Act. And she would never say exactly what the company was doing, but she was working for Avery Scales. And Avery Scales produced precision equipment, precision weighing equipment, measuring equipment. And my guess is that in some way it was involved with the defense industry. But she never said. And this morning I discovered hidden in the purse which I had kept from when she died, a small card dated much later. It's dated 1977, but it's got her signature on and says she has signed this and is now subject to the Official Secrets Act. And that was, well, getting on for 30 years later. So 1939, what's going on in Britain? It's conscription time. And seeing posters like this, my father signed up. And he signed up on the 3rd of June. And how do I know that? Because she kept a diary for 4 months of her life. And in it, I found this entry. And she was not happy about him signing up. Not sure that he was particularly happy, and he could have been exempted, but he chose not to. And I never saw her diary until after my aunt died, or just before my aunt died. She gave it to me. And it's got stuff in it which is fascinating, but also quite distressing to read. So I'm not going to go into any details of that. But while my dad was busy signing up as a conscript, my mum and her sister were being lured by other things. If you look at the population register, you can see my mum is listed as a shorthand typist, but on the right, it says she's also done first aid, clerical work, and it says Clissold. Clissold was the swimming baths. And it was in the swimming baths with no water that she was stationed during the war sorry. Oh, sorry. This is an aside. She showed up as married on the population register, but that was 6 months before she married. This is the ketubah, the Jewish wedding certificate, showing that she married on the 17th of March. But the population register shows her as married in September. The civil register shows her marrying on the 17th of March the following year. So I don't understand the entry. But anyway, back we go. Oh, so I've missed something. Meanwhile, in the desert, my father was one of one of 6 brothers, a bit like Saving Private Ryan, who were all posted in the services. So if you look on the left, there are his brothers, Mark, Sam, Isaac, Jaime, and Arnold, and he's bottom center. And there's a description of what they were doing in the war. If you look on the right, there is a picture of him with his platoon, and he was in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and they're outside the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. And that is going to prove to be very significant, but later on. Meanwhile, in Europe, there's a picture of my 2 aunts, Yetta and Shelley, my mum's younger and older sister, Shelley's husband, Gerson, and their children, Barent and Leentje. And this is where they ended up. In that picture, my Aunt Yetta is the only one who survived. She had been at a wedding in Amsterdam representing the London family. Shortly before she died, she showed me a picture of the wedding posed in a field with a farm cart. There were 28 people around this cart. I don't know what has happened to that picture, but she told me of the 28 people, she was the only one who got through the war. And it was because she was, I think, 16 years old. She was in Amsterdam. There were rumors that something terrible was going to happen. And she was told there's a train coming through Amsterdam with children from Germany and you can get on it. And she got on it and arrived at Liverpool Street Station on the penultimate of the kinder transport trains. She wasn't a kinder transport child. She was just on the same train. And because she spoke German, she was able to speak to some of the children. And I went with her when they unveiled the statue in Liverpool Street Station. And you remember I said that her family lived in triangles. They also died in triangles. Amsterdam went to Westerbork and Auschwitz. Antwerp went to Mechelen and Auschwitz. And they're the triangles that they died in. But there were other triangles in the family. There were the political Jews. There were the gay Jews. There were the antisocial Jews. The Nazis had a labeling system for everything. And these are just some of the badges that they put on their prisoners. And my family got a fair deal of those. But there was also work going on for peace. The Red Cross was trying to rescue people from the concentration camps. And this man, Volker Bernadotte, Count of Visborg, who was the son of a Swedish prince who had married a commoner and therefore lost his inheritance rights, he headed the Swedish Red Cross. And I did talk about him in a previous talk, which I gave called Cousins 3 per Crate. And I said how he had bought 3 of my mother's cousins. He wouldn't have known that they were cousins. These were just people in I think, Auschwitz concentration camp for a crate of whiskey. And he had transported them to Sweden, where they lived out the war and were able to survive. And he was going around Europe doing this. But he's better known internationally for his white bus program. How is he related to us? My mum's second cousin once removed married his 13th cousin once removed. So that's how we're related. He couldn't have known. There was no way these people could know how they were related, but related they were. And during World War II, he saved over 31 prisoners. He's best known for the white bus program of the Swedish Red Cross. That saved over 20,000. And the bus on the right in Odense in Denmark is one of the buses carrying the father of my Danish best friend, who until a few months ago, I had no idea had been rescued by Folke Bernadotte. What's interesting about the white bus program, and it's a big difference between what's happening in Ukraine today and what was happening in Germany, the Germans actually respected the program. They signed agreements with the Red Cross and they gave safe passage to Red Cross buses. They made things difficult. They blew roads up. They made it difficult for them to get fuel. They had to take fuel with them, but they did not attack the convoys. And when people are talking about Putin not being like the Nazis, in many ways, he's worse. And back we come to, what was my mum doing? Well, she'd seen the posters. They needed volunteers. She obviously liked the gear, the binoculars and the full gas uniform. So while her sister became an ambulance driver, she became an air raid precautions officer. And she met this man, Sam Fichtenberg, originally known as Fistenberg, who was to be part of her political education. In an interview, which I found in the Camden archives about 3 weeks ago, she said that her political education started when she was doing the air raid patrols with people who knew about politics. And Sam was very important. There he is 5 years later with his wife and 2 daughters. And this is what he was teaching her about. And he was about 15 years older than her. And for the rest of her life, he was not technically a role model, but she followed in his footsteps. And he was a kind of mentor. He was always around to give advice. And I'll come back to him later, because he persuaded her after the war to stand for the local council. And as you could see from all the headlines, Labour won a landslide, and the Daily Express described it as Gestapo in Britain if the socialists win. We'll come back to that because that theme repeats. So here we are in Stoke Newington, and she's now a councillor. It's 1945. There she is. That was taken in 1941. She's got the same face she had when she was 3. She's representing the Labour Party, and she loved the Labour Party's symbol. It's got enlightenment, it's got education, it's got work, and it's got liberty. All of those crucial elements that mattered to her, and which unfortunately you'd have difficulty deciphering from the present Labour Party's symbol. And internationally, what was happening? Well, we've got the UN formed, a peace dividend, the families moved to 89 Manor Road, and there's a stork on the way. And in that bag, that is my sister. Sorry if you're watching, Liz, but I thought that people would want to see a picture of you. But there were other X-rays going on at the same time, and they weren't so cheerful. Because my dad, who was studying medicine and was particularly keen on radiology and radiography, took X-rays. These are not X-rays of her. I got these off the internet, but I have the corresponding X-rays of her, but they are dirty. And I don't know how to clean them. And unless somebody can tell me, I don't want to damage them. They're acetate, so maybe somebody can tell me. Across the bottom, you will see a strip. In 1946, when this was taken, this was how X-rays were identified. They were black acetate and you wrote on them in white pen. My dad invented a system which is still in use today, which blocks out parts of the X-ray plate so that the name and other data become part of the image. They're not external, they can't be lost, you can't lose somebody's name or NHS number or the information about them because it's in the image. Unfortunately, like some of his other good ideas, he didn't patent it. He presented it at a conference, a radiology conference in 1951, and the next morning, somebody else patented it. And he didn't want to patent it because he wanted it to be in the public domain. It was a sad lesson that when people like Wilhelm Röntgen, the inventor of X-rays, wanted things to be in the public domain, he patented it and then made the patent publicly available. And my dad, I think, didn't know that, and he always resented it. Mind you, he resented a lot of things. And that was the diagnosis. Hodgkin's disease, 3 months to live, she must have an abortion, which she declined. At the time, the only treatment was chemotherapy, which was the most terrible chemicals with the most terrible side effects. But my dad was a lateral thinker. He never became a doctor for reasons that I'll go into if anybody wants, but basically because he was bloody minded. But he thought differently from other people. And if you remember, back in the desert in 1942, he was outside the Hadassah hospital. He probably went in, and inside the Hadassah hospital was this man, Ludwig Halberstädter. And don't worry about the chimp on the right. It's not being tested. It's the man holding it that's being tested. And my dad wrote to Professor Halberstädter, who replied and said the following: as you're aware, Hodgkin's disease is fatal. The duration of the disease, however, varies in each case. Cases with a duration of more than 8 years with X-ray treatment are by no means an exception. Cases have been recorded which lasted 15 years. As regards pregnancy, this has no adverse influence. What's interesting is, it turns out Professor Halberstädter was related, as you can see from the panel on the left, and proof that it didn't have an adverse effect on the fetus is given by my sister looking slightly older there than she did in the bag previously. It was an interesting battle in Britain to get them to listen to Professor Halberstadt's protocol for using radiotherapy without chemotherapy. But she was a patient of the one hospital St. Bartholomew's, that had the right kind of device for the radiotherapy that was necessary. And it kept her alive for the next 30 years. But what's interesting is Wilhelm Röntgen, the inventor of X-rays, and Marie and Pierre Curie, who developed techniques for using the X-rays, also turned out to have been relatives. And without them, she would not have been saved. So there we are in 1949, and the stork's carrying something that appears on the right as me. She was busy at the council, she was busy at the synagogue, she was taking a course at Birkbeck College, she was working 2 days a week in Hatton Garden for a cousin who was a jeweler. She did his administration and bookkeeping, and she had been told when she got pregnant with me, which is a fairly long story, once again, that not only could she not have me, but that her life expectancy had reduced from 3 months to 6 weeks, and that she wouldn't last the pregnancy. So she declined all of the blandishments to stop the radiotherapy and go on to chemotherapy, and produced, well, what is here today. Meanwhile, she had become active in the synagogue, the North London Progressive Synagogue in Stamford Hill, which had moved into an old church building in 1956. It had moved from 30 Amherst Park to 100 Amherst Park, and the decrepit building was modernized by a very bright young architect in the community who was called Derek Sharp, and turns out, of course, to have been related. But by the time they were about to consecrate the synagogue, my mum was chair of the synagogue council. And she was, they used in those days the term chairman, but she was a very competent chairman, and she usually got her way. And in this case, the text that appears above the synagogue, "Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly," was one of the 2 options that they gave her. She could either have gone for, or they could either have gone for justice, justice, shalt thou follow, or do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But she wasn't going to take any other suggestion. There are lots of synagogues where they have phrases that glorify God or talk about other actions, but that was what mattered to her. By that time, she was a magistrate, and she considered being a magistrate one of the most important jobs she could do in society, because it gave her an opportunity to help people who had ended up in the court system. There was quite an extensive network of social work associated with the courts. She could point people in the direction of others who would help them. And she could try and ensure that people who had got there through no fault of their own at least got help through the tragedy of having ended up in court. And that doesn't mean that she was easy on people who she thought deserved to be at least punished for their particular crimes. But in the booklet on the right, which she wrote to celebrate the first 50 years of progressive Judaism at North London Progressive Synagogue, the foreword was by the then rabbi, Sidney Brichto. And he said that the synagogue was inspired by the founders of liberal Judaism, by the idealism of Lily Montagu, Israel Mattock, Claude Montefiore, and there was another one, Basil Henricus. And they were the big names in progressive Judaism at the time. Turns out, and you can see on the panel on the right, all four of them were, of course, related. If you go out of here and turn right, the one at the top, Lily Montagu, unless they've changed the display, there is a stall displaying information about her life. She was the founder of liberal Judaism in this country. She was not a rabbi because there weren't women rabbis at the time, but she would have been. I remember meeting her. My mum had to greet her when she came for the inauguration or the consecration of the new synagogue. And she was just considered to be one of the leaders and pioneers of the community. What I don't think she knew, what I certainly didn't know, was that she was a relative. I'm not going to give you all of the family there, but that is the link, and she was a sixth cousin once removed. And what was happening in the rest of the world? Well, the lady on the left, Eleanor Roosevelt, is holding the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, she's often credited with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in fact, it was originally drafted by an English lawyer called John Peters Humphrey, who I had the pleasure of meeting very briefly in Montreal, where he lived at that time. But this was such an important thing that when my mum died, I discovered in her purse she had a pocket-sized version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I remember seeing her in meetings when discussions were going on. She would take out this little book, look at it, sometimes note things, and put it away again. And it's like she tested everything that was going on against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I carried her copy with me for several years until it was shredded along with most of my clothes in a helicopter accident in Angola in 1992. And although I got another copy, I never, unfortunately, managed to retrieve more than a scrap of one page of the original. But this is how Eleanor Roosevelt was related. Meanwhile, in Israel, the United Nations had appointed Volker Bernadotte to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. And within weeks, he was dead, killed by Israeli terrorists, the Stern Gang, known as Lehi. And for more than 30 years, diplomatic relations between Israel and Sweden were very strained. They eventually re-stabilized. But Yitzhak Shamir not only never apologized, he headed the gang, he signed off the order for the killing of Volker Bernadotte. As punishment, he became Israel's 7th prime minister. And most of the members of the gang who carried out the killing became members of parliament or cabinet ministers. And even more shocking for me, he was related. So there's one cousin killing another cousin who's saved thousands of other cousins, plus, more important, tens of thousands of other people. Had he not been killed, it's almost certain that Volker Bernadotte would have gone on to be the first Swedish Secretary General of the UN. But we know what happened to the first Swedish Secretary General of the UN. He was killed by terrorists. So it looks like it's not necessarily a hopeful future. Back we come to Stoke Newington. I'm going to jump forward to 1957-8, her mayoral year. And sorry, you missed that, but on the left is a family group. You've got Millie and Monty and my sister Liz and me, looking demure, of course, as I always do, On the right was the reception program, and in it there was an entertainer known as Afrique. And he was apparently a very good singer and a very good impersonator. And he had spent many of the war years doing impersonations of both Hitler and Churchill, amongst others. And there are short pathé movies of him on YouTube if you want to see them. And the reason that I've included him is that not he, but his daughter appears later, and I hope we'll have time to get to it, but we may not, in which case it'll have to be for a future story. But it turns out he was also related. And about 3 weeks ago in Hackney archives, going through the mayoral files, I found a letter. And it was from somebody who signed herself, I don't know if you can see that, but she signed herself as cousin. And she was the wife of the mayor of Chelsea. And his name was Sir Basil Marsden Smedley, or rather Sir Basil Footvoy Marsden Smedley. And she wrote two things on there which were of particular interest. First of all, cousin. Now, I didn't know that my mum knew that she knew cousins who were Tory mayors, but obviously in this case, she knew this cousin who was the wife of the mayor. The Marsden Smedleys were a very wealthy family. And they were a family who had come 2 or 3 generations before my grandfather, but they had been diamond polishers like my grandfather. Unfortunately, at the end of World War I, my grandfather was invalided out with malaria and with, what do they call it? Forgotten the name, it'll come to me in a moment. What's the name of glandular fever? Sorry? That's later. There's a name for the condition. The virus is what causes it, but it's known as, oh, it'll come to me anyway. So my grandfather had a tremor, and a tremor is not something you want if you're a diamond polisher. So he never worked again as a diamond polisher, and he struggled for the rest of his life and got jobs as a market trader, as a sales rep, and that was all. So am I going on for too long? Because I'm only about halfway through. And the program seems, oh, there it is. That was the connection between them. I stuck this in. This is nothing to do with genealogy, but I found this picture last night, and I've been looking for one of these for years. We were the only family I knew in Stoke Newington that had a goat. Why my dad had bought this goat, you would have to ask him. We were driving home from Southend, and on the way to Southend, he had seen this sign that said, kids for sale, 10 shillings. And he said, oh, he said, I'll buy one on the way home. So on the way home, he stopped the car. And interestingly, it was in what is now, I think, the Wanstead and Woodford constituency, or the Ilford South constituency. And there was a farm. And he got out of the car and we said, where are you going? He said, oh, he said, I'll be back in a minute. And he came back with 2 goats on chains. And he said, which one do you want? And we thought he was joking. And one was black and white and one had brown hair. And I chose the one with light brown hair and called her Jeannie with the light brown hair. So Now, she was borrowed by scouts and cadet groups as a kind of mascot when they were having parades. God knows what happened to their parades, because I'm sure she never went in any direction that they were hoping to march. But that's probably punishment for what they were doing anyway. So back to the synagogue. Oh, sorry, this slide got duplicated and I couldn't find it to remove it. So we have to get out of that. And it's stuck. Right. So, as I've said, justice was very important to her, and she was appointed to the Consumer Council, where she served on the Crowther Committee on Consumer Credit. And that was something which was very important, because if things look like the Wild West now in terms of lending, particularly to the poor, there was no regulation whatsoever of anything that wasn't banks back in the 50s and 60s when they worked. And they produced draft legislation, which eventually became law. It includes things like the APR, the annual percentage rate of interest, because previously there was no way of knowing how much interest you were paying. And based on that, she did a lot of work on consumer protection. In 1962, St. Pancras merged with two other boroughs to become Camden. And the man on the left, previously known as Sammy Fistenberg and then Sammy Fichtenberg, became the interim leader of the council during its transition from the three old boroughs to Camden, and then its first mayor. And he went on to become Sir Sammy Fisher, Lord Samuel Fisher, and later on, he was president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Now, my father was also a deputy while Sammy was serving. And I throw this one in because he was one of the first Camden councillors. He has now been deselected to left wing for the current Labour Party in Camden, Councillor Roger Robinson. I could have chosen any one of a dozen councillors, but I chose him because he's still there. And he, like so many of the others, turned out to be related. He is a nephew of Manny Shinwell. And those of you who were around in the 40s, 50s, and 60s will certainly know the name. And Millie was related by one marriage to Manny Shinwell. So that means that Roger was a cousin by marriage. And there she is as mayor. And I've put in this picture, not because she liked pictures of the Queen Mother, but because she didn't. 3 days before the mayor making, a military coup took place in Greece. And she decided that she would allow a delegation of Greek people to come and protest and to petition the council for support against the military coup that had taken place in Greece. Now, a mayor-making ceremony cannot deal with other business than the appointment of the mayor, the deputy mayor, and the various officers of the council for that year. So what she had to do was convene an extraordinary meeting that followed immediately at the end in order to receive the delegation. What was interesting is if you look at the newspaper cutting on the right, which says Greek coup is not for the council, the Tories objected and walked out. So human rights, I'm sure they're all in favor of, but clearly not Greek human rights. Or maybe they thought that the Greek colonel's human rights were more important than anything else. So here are some of the things that she did. She planted this cherry tree in Tavistock Square in memory of the victims of Hiroshima. And every August the 6th, we commemorate Hiroshima Day. You can see the plaque. That's not the original plaque. The original plaque was wooden and rotted away. And we made up a stainless steel plaque. And she didn't like monuments, but she did love her tree. And I'll tell you a little more about that at the end. One of the other things she did was she bought a boat and she made it available to all of the children. She fought for homes. These are houses in Denmark on which the Alexandra estate is probably based, and they were her inspiration. And they, interestingly, were by an architectural team called Moltke and Fries was almost certainly related, but I haven't yet found the connection. No, highly improbable. And they set up all sorts of services, including consumer protection. And they fought for tenants' rights, and they built homes, and they stopped selling council houses, and they stood against the implementation of forced council rent increases. And this is a phrase that my mum told me. It's one of the few political lessons she ever gave me, and it's wrong. She said to me, when things go wrong, governments will always intervene to save the banks. And she made a mistake. And the mistake was to err, because she left out the ER between the K and the S. The governments don't care about the banks. In the banking crisis of 2008, they allowed banks to go to the wall. The people who were saved were the bankers. In the banking crisis of 2008 in the United States, not a single banker was prosecuted except for one Korean man in New York who ran a community bank for 300 families, and he won. But Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, they emerged unscathed, and the bankers, as we now know, are richer than ever. So thanks for the lesson, Mum, but I'm putting it right now. But you were nearly right. So on to Parliament and Ilford North. And this is the election address of somebody called Tom Iremonger, who was the sitting member of Parliament. And in his election address, he called the Labour Party Red Nazis. And on election day, they put out a leaflet drop, and I can't find the leaflet, but I know I've got it somewhere, which went to Jewish households saying that a vote for Labour is a vote for Red Nazis. And to what they identified as non-Jewish households, they put this thing in fake Cyrillic script, saying vote Labour comrade, but it was put out by the Conservatives overnight. And as if that weren't enough, when she won, the returning officer refused to allow her to speak at the count. He said he had a rule. He said he would allow the person with the highest and the lowest votes to speak. So there were 3 constituencies in the town hall, and I think that it was somebody, it was the MP for Wanstead and Woodford who had the highest number of votes. And I don't know who had the lowest number of votes, but they didn't stop there. The newspapers locally for the next 3 weeks argued about whether she was giving a communist salute at the count. Now, if she was giving a communist salute, I'm guessing that there are football teams across the country that count their communist saluting supporters in the tens of thousands. So one of the things she got involved in was slavery. I only found out by looking at the files in Redbridge archives, and then looking at the files in the London Metropolitan Archives, and I'll come to those in a minute, that what happens is that when a member takes on an issue and is identified as doing that, other members then pass things to them. So I would find letters addressed to other members of Parliament that were copied to her with replies to constituents saying, I've passed your letter to Millie Miller, who is leading on slavery. And unfortunately, she died before she could achieve what she wanted on this. But I throw this in, and this is not strictly genealogical, it's DNA logical, because this is a record. And let me tell you this little story. In 1974-5, a friend of mine said, I've got a flat in Amsterdam, I'm selling it, it's free at the moment, would you like to go for a week? And I went. I spent a lovely week there. And as I was leaving, I heard a song on the radio. And I wanted to get this song, but I didn't have time. I had to catch a train. And I didn't think I would catch the train if I stopped for the record. The next weekend, my parents went to Ostend for the weekend, partly just for a weekend away, but partly because my mum was investigating brothels masquerading as nightclubs that were basically recruiting English girls to work as go-go dancers who were then passportless, moneyless, and trapped in Ostend. And this was close to hand. I mean, not even dealing with slavery and prostitution further away, which she got very involved in. And I said to my mum, could you please buy a copy of this record? She went into a record shop, she bought a copy of this record, and then she said to the man, oh, she said, can I get a copy of the record that's playing? And he said, that's the one you've just bought. So she heard the song that I'd heard, and it had obviously said something to her. Jump forward 20 years, and I was helping my aunt clear her flat. And there's this record. And I said, what are you doing with my record? And she said, that's not your record, that's my record. I bought it on a weekend trip to Ostend. In fact, my husband and I went on this trip to Ostend for the weekend, and as we were getting off a tram, your mum and dad were getting on. And my aunt had heard this same record and had bought it. And the reason that it's important is it's about elder abuse. It's about people in an old people's home. It's about having been abandoned and left at the non-care of the non-care system as it was being portrayed. And it obviously struck all three of us as being significant, and yet somehow we never discussed it. I had no idea that my aunt got it. I knew that my mother had heard it and wanted to buy it and then been told that that's what she'd just bought. But anyway, I'm not going to play it to you because it's in Dutch, but it's a lovely song. And it led to change in the care system in Holland. Meanwhile, her main concern was homelessness. And her main achievement in Parliament was to pilot through the bill, the 1977 Housing Act, which would have transformed housing provision in this country forever. And it had a companion bill that she was working on at the time of her death, which was the Housing Single Persons and Homeless Bill, which never made it into law because Margaret Thatcher was elected. She scrapped, or rather she overrode the 1977 Act, and the Housing Single Persons and Homeless Act never came to fruition. Right, here we are back in London. You remember that machine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital giving her the treatment that she needed to survive? It was switched off. The doctor who had been treating her for more than 20 years moved on, became head of oncology at Southampton Hospital or Hospital University Complex. New young doctor came in, and he, the first time he met my mother, said to her, "There are new guidelines. You've already had more than enough radiotherapy than should kill a normal person. We cannot give you any more. You can have chemotherapy." And she said, "If you give me chemotherapy, I'll be dead within 6 months." And they did, and she was. And despite the battle, and she got more and more ill, she started the chemotherapy. It did what it had done in 1946. It made her very ill. It caused all sorts of problems. A friend and neighbor, Rose Hacker, who also turns out to be related, who's a whole bunch of other stories, had tried to get her help through the British Naturopathic Society, which was part of the British Osteopathy Society. And she'd gone on to a vegetarian diet. And since she wasn't well enough to cook, I did all the cooking. And I found amongst her notes diet sheets that she had to keep and show the doctor at the naturopathic clinic what she was eating. I had been awarded a scholarship to go and study in Spain. She was so ill that I didn't go. I stayed looking after her. And she kept saying, "You have to go, you have to go." And I kept saying, "I can't, I'll go soon." And then Rose Hacker arranged for her to go to a clinic run by the Naturopathic Society. And she said, "When I go to this clinic, I'll be in good hands, you go." So on a Saturday, we set off in an ambulance. We got an ambulance from St. John's Ambulance, whom my aunt drove ambulances for, although by that time she was retired from that. And we went to this place, and just seeing that still makes my blood run cold. This was the building, it's known as Tyringham Hall, where the clinic was located. And this was the view you got as you came up the drive. And we arrived, and she was so weak that I don't even know how she'd got that far. She had been dealing with phone calls from constituents until literally she got into the ambulance to leave. And she was going to be there for 2 to 3 weeks. When we got there, she said, "I'm hungry." She hadn't been hungry for weeks. And we tried to get some food, and it wasn't a mealtime. And this was a place where they were very strict on eating. And by the time they managed to rustle her up an egg, it was already too late. And I remember her saying to me, "I thought I came here to be in safe hands." And all I could say was, "You're in my hands." And she said, "Then I know I'm in safe hands." And those were her last words. But it doesn't end there. There's the death certificate, and I've sort of complained about this before. It says she died at the clinic, Tyringham House, Tyringham, Newport Pagnell, Berkshire. Well, people doing genealogical research will see something like that and think, oh, she had moved to Newport Pagnell, or she'd moved to Buckinghamshire. She never left London. She was a Cockney, she was a Londoner. She never left London all her life. On this particular occasion, she'd only been out of London for less than an hour. And she certainly hadn't moved anywhere. And that upsets me to see that particular death certificate. But I found this in the London Metropolitan Archives. I have blanked out the names because of general data protection. I don't have the permission of the sender. But this is a letter that a little girl had written to her a couple of weeks earlier, asking her to campaign against animal testing. And in the file, I found this. And this was from my aunt, who was working as my mum's sister. And I had no idea that she carried on dealing with correspondence. She wasn't being paid. I didn't have any money to pay her. But from the files, I see that she carried on dealing with correspondence for the next 6 weeks. And so I think my mum and her sister carried on for a long time. Now I'm going to end with this because this is something that was very important to my mum. And I could do 3 or 4 talks on any one of the topics that I've covered today. But 3 weeks before she died, she gave a talk to a Jewish women's organization about 100 yards from where the cherry tree is. Woburn House, which was then the headquarters of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, housed various organizations, and there were others in Endell Gardens and Endell Street, which are behind Tavistock Square. And I was at home and the phone rang, and she said, I'm at, and she said the name of the organization, and I have a letter from this organization, a condolence letter. And she said, I'm not well enough to drive home. Can you come and get me? So I said yes. And she said, I will be waiting under my cherry tree. And on the way home, she said, I think that was the best talk I've ever given. And I said, what was it about? And she said, it was about the rights of the Palestinians. And in the condolence letters, there is a letter from this organization. And I don't know if it's normal in condolence letters, but they say how much they enjoyed having her, how much they enjoyed her talk, and how forthright she had been. And I think for somebody whose whole life was devoted to human rights, that was a very important last talk. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take questions on anything that I've said or related matters, but after we've had a break. Thank you.